Again, just waiting for things to begin here at the Annenberg Center.
Our monthly series is a partnership of three organizations, as I think our regulars know: the Public Diplomacy Council, the Public Diplomacy Association of America, and the University of Southern California Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy. Our program today is quite timely. If you've looked at the front page of today's New York Times or Washington Post, it's on both. It's on the front page of both papers, and very high on the website. Always a topic which gets attention, and so we are grateful to our two speakers today who are joining us to address this from a base of years of research on this. Before it became front page news, they were already working on it. Our two speakers are Peter Warren Singer. Full bios are in your programs, on your chairs. Dr. Singer is strategist and senior fellow at New America Foundation, the author of multiple award-winning books, a contributing editor to Popular Science. He's described by the Wall Street Journal as the premier futurist in national security environment. He's consulted for the Defense Department, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and he's advised a range of entertainment programs, including for Warner Brothers, DreamWorks, Universal, HBO, Discovery, the History Channel, and what I think is still the #1 video game of all time, Call of Duty. He's been named by the Smithsonian as one of the nation's 100 leading innovators, by Defense News as one of the 100 most influential people in defense issues, by Foreign Policy to their top 100 global thinkers list, and my favorite title as Mad Scientist for the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. Our other speaker is Emerson Brooking. He is an expert on the relationship between social media and conflict. He's been a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and research associate for defense policy, also at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he studied defense budgeting and strategy. His 2016 cover story for The Atlantic may have been the first major report on what we're going to talk about today, titled War Goes Viral, Predicted the Weaponization of Social Media. Brooking is the co-author of Mending the Broken Dialogue, Military Advice on Presidential Decision-Making, and he's been published in Foreign Policy, Wired, Popular Science, The National Interest, and appears regularly on NPR. So where are we now? We seem to be every day discovering some new way in which things are less secure than we thought they were.
Well, first I want to begin by thanking the various organizations, the school, the council, the Annenberg Center, that have all helped us join you today to speak on these topics of social media and its impact on news, politics, and war. And thank you also for the very kind introduction. Maybe as a starting point, and then we can kick back and forth in conversation of where are we, is the very term itself, like war, what it means, and what are we exactly talking about in this project on like war, the weaponization of social media. And essentially, like so much else in this space, it's a play on words. It has a double meaning. One is the idea that social media began as a space for fun, then it became a space for profit, some of the most profitable companies, most powerful companies in the world, and it remains that. It remains a communication space, it remains a social space, it remains a marketplace, but that it has also become like war. It's become a conflict space where every single debate, but also battle, whether it's a physical battle, one of the opening scenes in the book is the Battle of Mosul in Iraq, but also election and the like is being fought online and in many ways being determined by what plays out online. So the first is about how social media has become like war in terms of battles and sides going back and forth and the like. The second is we believe it's become a new mode of conflict itself. So if you think of cyber war as the hacking of networks, Like war, what we're calling like war, is the hacking of people on the networks by driving ideas viral through a mix of likes, shares, and lies. And what's fascinating we found is when we looked at this kind of mode of conflict itself, we looked at a wide variety of actors, everything from the Donald Trump campaign to ISIS to Taylor Swift to corporations like Wendy's, to Chicago gangs. They're wildly different organizations with wildly different real-world goals, but they were using the very same tactics online to achieve their online goals. So there are a series of kind of best tactics, procedures. There's best ways of fighting at like war, whether you are a celebrity, a political campaign, to a military unit, and relevant to, I think, what we're going to talk about a little bit later today. In fact, you see the very same tactics being used. So in the news today is how you saw actors trying to shape an election in Alabama by mimicking what everyone from the Trump campaign to Russian military units had done in other activities. So you get this kind of back and forth. And so that's the essence of what like war is. And one of the messages of the book project is that we better get used to it, because we're going to be seeing it again and again on whatever the news of the day is.
And something we discovered in our research and try to emphasize again and again is that something that did not happen in the real world, but nonetheless a story goes viral about it, can have then a real political effect on events that come. Meanwhile, something that actually happens that receives little attention might well have not happened at all. There is this parallel battle space now in which the United States and anyone who wants to succeed in modern conflict has to invest sufficient resources.
One of the things that the actors in these digital campaigns, what they want to do is to remain hidden, to remain secret. So how did you research this?
So we draw a distinction between two different types of campaigns, and they feed off each other. They're the very public campaigns, those that seek to use social media to amplify their influence and to project more power and capability than they might actually possess. The Islamic State is an excellent example of this in practice. Then there's a second type of campaign, a kind of subterranean manipulation, which takes place out of sight of social media users, but they very clearly see the salient effects. Obvious example here is the intelligence services of the Russian Federation. And could you speak a bit more to the research method?
Sure. So I think one of the things that drove us in this project, and we've been at it for about 5 years to give you the sense of the scale of it. And what drove us is that, strangely, for a space that's about connection, that's about networks, is that there was a massive amount of stovepiping going on. So you had geographic stovepiping. The people that were interested in whether it was interested in terms of researching, interested in terms of being the journalists writing on it, to interested in the actual people fighting in it on topics like ISIS and the Middle East, were unfamiliar with, often uninterested in what, for example, Russia was doing in Ukraine. In turn, the people that were interested in, say, American electoral politics, everything from voters to the journalists assigned to cover political campaigns, were unfamiliar with what Russia was doing in Ukraine. So there would be things that would happen that someone would, if they could make the connection, would go, actually, this is just what Russia did in Ukraine, but it would seem completely new and unfamiliar to someone, for example, looking at American electoral politics. The same thing was going on if you were in not just kind of geographic connection, but topical. People interested in war disconnected from people interested in and working on Silicon Valley. And so you would have generals literally saying to us, why are they doing X, Y, and Z? And someone who knew Silicon Valley would be like, well, that's the utterly natural thing that a company would do. The same thing when it connects the research world and the serious world of policy and politics with celebrity and fame. So you would have someone do, we would see ISIS do something and they go, wow, this is new, this is innovative. And anyone who knew anything about everything from video games to Taylor Swift would be like, that's not new and innovative, that's out there. So we tried to bring these different cases together. Another aspect of it is methodology. So this is a space where there's just a massive amount of data. So you can finally do really big quantitative, large-in studies, and so there's been this, wonderful mapping of what's going on. So you can map out, here's what Russian sock puppet accounts were doing. Here's the 60,000 different accounts that ISIS was doing. But that was disconnected from people interested in, say, military history or communication studies or the field of psychology or public diplomacy. And so you found those connections weren't being made. And then the final methodology that we applied to it is very rarely were people speaking to the people at work in the field. So we went around interviewing, again, this wildly diverse set of people, everything from tech company executives to recruiters for extremist groups to people working in public diplomacy at the State Department to the military, both active duty to retired people that later would make the news in a major way. For example, General Michael Flynn, to celebrities, people who appeared in MTV reality shows and the like. And again, by bringing these different people together, we found insights that cut across. And I think that is part of that was part of the fun of the journey and the fun of the book, but again, also allowed us to make connections, draw insights that wouldn't have otherwise been possible.
And I'll add, it was remarkable to track this issue as it became one of such national importance and salience. When Peter and I had our first conversations about this, it was back in 2012 and 2013. Big events then regarding the weaponization of social media were Operation Pillar of Defense, an 8-day inconclusive air campaign fought between the IDF and Hamas. But in the real world, or online, saw the transit of some 10 million Twitter messages from folks around the world. It was called the first Twitter war. Around the same time, the U.S. military relaxes regulations on social media use overseas. And we see in Kenya, Al-Shabaab launches a live-tweeted terror attack on the Westgate Mall. 3-day running siege. They kill 67 people, but they, rather than the Kenyan government, are the reliable source of information. That's what gets us started on this journey. But then we're in a unique position when we see the rise of the Islamic State, the revelations of Russian manipulation and everything since, to apply that perspective that we gathered, because of the long timeline.
And one last thing I would add, that there's another difference about this topic, certainly from ones that I've worked on in the past, is that you can both study it, but you can also jump into the fray yourself. So throughout this period that we are doing this gathering of, whether it is the interviews to pulling in lessons from what did the Telegraph do to international diplomacy, we're also doing everything from trolling Russian trolls, setting honey traps for them so that they reveal themselves and we learn from that, to joining online armies for different nations out there. And so it's a little bit of, I think of there's in other spaces, like in sports reporting, you sometimes have seen like writers trying, they join a sports team. George Plimpton, there's a famous thing, doing that. He became, if I recall, a kicker for the Detroit Lions. Part of what we learned from this was by doing, which is, hard sometimes to do in like studies of other spaces.
Well, in all of this research and all the interviews you've done over the years, excuse me, are there one or two, either people or events or scenes that stand out?
You're first on that.
Sure. So for me, something that really stood out, that just spoke to how social media has flattened political dialogue and the ability for unusual actors to have an outsized voice in international conversation, was the number of times that there were young girls who were major political players. We have a domestic example to start, which is Hilde Lysiak, who is an investigative reporter in the small town of Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania. She launched her newspaper at the age of 7. Her first major story was the birth of her baby brother, and she had a subscriber count in, I think, the dozens. But because she was hyper-local and because she was good at commanding the internet and getting her reporting out there, she was also first on the ground to report on a local murder scene and local murder investigation. And quite quickly, not necessarily the murder, but the fact that she was the one who was leading the coverage of it, became an international story. And this is, a local enterprising American journalist, but there are 2 other 7-year-old girls. One, which I think a lot of folks here will be familiar with, is Bana Alabed, who's been called the 21st century Anne Frank, whose live tweeting from besieged Aleppo gave us remarkable and unprecedented understanding of what it was like for civilians suffering that besiegement. And then another girl who started at the age of 7 goes by the moniker Jana Jihad. And she works out of the West Bank using her mother's iPhone to document IDF roadblocks and operations, and says that she's a journalist, but also that her smartphone serves as a kind of weapon. And that just illustrates how vastly different this terrain is, how people with virtually no resources can nonetheless come to command such vast attention and thereby power and influence.
My favorite, I think, is relevant to a lot of the folks gathered in this room are interested in particular in public diplomacy. And we had a fun but strange experience where we interviewed a young man named Spencer Pratt. If you know pop culture, you'll be familiar with him. If not, he is the person who brought the Kardashians into your lives. He originally was a producer of the first TV show that brought them onto the screen. He then decided that he wanted to be a celebrity himself, and so he finagled his way onto a reality show where he met his wife, Heidi, and they became kind of a celebrity phenomena called Spidey. And at one point in time, they were the highest paid reality celebrities, even more than the current president of the United States himself. They actually considered him a bit of a rival. And he talked, actually the 2 of them talked us through, they're just incredibly nice, but they're talking us through how they, in essence, manipulated, in their words, the media to achieve their goals, and their goals was celebrity. And they in particular reinforce several of the key lessons that we drew in the book, one especially on the importance of the power of narrative. And a couple of days later, after talking with Spencer, who's kind of this Southern California bro, we go to the State Department. And we meet with the team that is in charge of countering ISIS online. And very quickly, we realized that Spencer got it, and the State Department team didn't. That he intimately understood how to win in this space, and that we as a nation, though, as a government, we're not going to do well because at the time, the people that were running this counter-ISIS operation didn't get it, and we even had this kind of internal like, should we maybe link them up with Spencer out in Malibu? But the point is, it very captured this sense of the strangeness of this space, and yet how insights could come from different spaces. And since then, though, we've seen how actually both in politics and in national security, we've seen people drawing from these spaces of celebrity, both for better and for worse. And I think that also echoes something that Emerson brought in, the sort of the duality of all of this. One of the lessons of these different little girl actors is how social media can be, it can be a story where it's a power used for good. It can also be a story where it's a power used for violence. The very same tactics have this sort of twin effect.
So you've, again, seen, you said the State Department didn't get it. Do you think they're getting it now? Can't resist.
We have advanced in some areas, but there are other areas where, frankly, it still doesn't. And I think one of the issues is striking a balance between trying to achieve virality, but also credibility. And there have been a couple of campaigns where it's particularly backfired for the State Department. The hashtag swagger one would be a great illustration of something that had one intent and instead had an opposite effect.
Well, it's not, we want to get to audience questions in just a moment, but it sounds like this has no rules. That Like War is just without rules. Is that correct?
So there are a couple of rules to consider. I'll start with a few. The first is that the truth is out there. There was a time when there was a reasonable expectation that if you were, say, conducting high-level negotiations or a secret special operation somewhere in the world, that this fact would stay hidden for quite a long time. There's no longer any certainty regarding that because of the proliferation of smartphones and social media. There are innumerable examples, more and more every day. One we point to in the book is the inadvertent live tweeting of the 2011 raid to capture and kill Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Top secret operation, only a few people know about it, conducted by our most qualified special operations teams, but nonetheless, there's a Pakistani IT guy who's up late working on a project who hears the helicopters and then starts tweeting about it because they're keeping him up at night. And immediately, as President Obama announces the results of that operation, media can link that story with his inadvertent lifetime reporting, and that immediately provides a new source of information. And this world of sensors of available information has only exploded since then. At the time of this inadvertent live tweeting, Pakistan had an internet penetration rate of something like 6%. That's like more than quadrupled now. And pretty soon there will be, in fact, there already is a reasonable expectation that there is a smartphone or some evidence that will track you if you go somewhere. In the book, we spoke with the CIA officer who said, with more than a twinge of regret, that secrets now come with a half-life. But even though the truth is out there, it's easier than ever to hide it. The new form of censorship does not so much involve state authorities scrubbing away stories that they don't particularly like, that they don't find appealing, trying to keep the truth from the population that way. Rather, it's much easier to just sow 10 or 12 other narratives to exist alongside the evidence of that one nugget of truth, and thereby discredit all possible explanations for something. And of course, Russia is the progenitor and the principal pioneer of this disinformation tactic today.
And I think given this idea of the truth is out there, but it can be buried underneath a sea of lies. And again, that you can think of that in terms of international conflict, to ISIS operations, to U.S. domestic politics, to how teenagers act online and the like. There's a thread that runs through that. What matters then is virality. What goes viral or not is what wins out. The networks were designed not to reward veracity. They were not designed to reward the truth. They were designed to reward virality. And that's simply how the companies make profit. That's the business structure of it. So given that, then there's a series of practices, there's a series of rules on how you drive something viral or not. And again, we found this just utterly engaging in how the very same tactics would be used by quite different actors. So we could tick through them real quickly, but I spoke to one. It's the power of narrative. Another one is this idea. It sounds like a contradiction, but it's planned authenticity. And this was exemplified by both the celebrity Taylor Swift, but also Junaid Hussain, who was ISIS's top recruiter. And both of them had this understanding that being seen as real mattered the most. And both of them, it truly was them who would engage out there. They would both engage in a practice, Taylor Swift called it tailorking. It was really her, and she would sort of monitor what her fans were talking about, and then she would reach down and personally engage with them. And it might be congratulating someone on passing their driver's license test. It might be consoling someone who broke up with their boyfriend. It really is her. But she would do it in knowledge that the whole world was watching. So it combined this different nature of social media from other communication platforms, where it can be both, it's simultaneously a one-on-one conversation, but it's being broadcast to the world. And Junaid Hussain would do the exact same thing in winning his followers' hearts and minds. Oh, by the way, Donald Trump does the very same thing. And it might be trying to do that in a positive way, winning hearts and minds that way. It might also be doing it in a way of drawing attention, an internet beef, engaging in an argument with someone, calling someone names on a one-on-one basis with the intent of the whole world is watching, and then I can draw attention to me. I can pull attention away from some other topic. And again, Trump masters this very early on, well before actually his eye turns to politics. He realizes this is the way for him to win online, and then it becomes a way for him to win at politics. And so there's a series of sort of lessons of winning at virality, which then allows you to achieve your other goals, whether it is to sell music albums, recruit someone to join your terrorist organization, recruit someone to vote for you. The very same tactics win out.
Well, we're going to have microphones on both sides of the room, so we'll invite your questions and comments. I'm looking at Arnold. You usually do have one. While we're getting the microphone over to Arnold, so what should or can the government or any of us do about this?
So there's a series of, the last section of the book is all on the what can we do about it. And I think it's very important to have this because right now there's a lot of negativity around this space, and we sort of feel like it's all for the worse and there's no turning back. But first, as we lay out in these examples, there is always a positive and a negative illustration of the use of these tactics, the use of these lessons. It feels like the negative side has won out, I think, for two reasons. The first is that we had this sort of crazy techno-optimism that took hold. Probably it hit its high point during the Arab Spring, where we just assumed this was all for the better, and that anything that was happening on social media would immediately reinforce democracy, the positive side. You can even, Facebook had used to push as a marketing line, the more we connect, the better it gets. And that was taken, that had one meaning back in like 2011. Now, of course, that line, the more we connect, the better it gets, coming from Facebook feels a little bit creepy because post-Arab Spring, post all the things that have played out in elections to revelations about loss of privacy and like, we're kind of on the other side where we have techno-pessimism. So that's one reason why it feels we kind of, we're swinging one way, now we're swinging the other, and we're trying to say no, it's really both. The second is the forces of bad have been winning more because they've better understood these lessons. They've been more willing to put them into place. So given that, to directly answer your question, what can we do? What can we do on the governmental side? One is to understand that this is a battle space, and this is a battle space that matters. I think there's a lot of parallels with what played out with cybersecurity over the last 15 years, where we went from not paying attention to it to saying, hold it, we need to recognize that it is an issue of both personal security, economic security, and national security. And government needs to reorganize around it. It needs to do everything from develop a national strategy. We have a national strategy for cybersecurity. We don't have one for this other form of online threats. And that national security will involve everything from reorganizing at the agency level all the way down to helping digital literacy. It is very strange that the U.S. government provides funding for Ukrainian students to learn how to identify Russian disinformation threats, but we don't have that for our own populace. And again, you can kind of see the cross relevant to this audience of like public diplomacy issues external to the domestic side. Some of it may be creating new organizations, new programs. Other parts of it may be bringing back old programs. Back during the Cold War, we had what was known as the Active Measures Working Group. It brought together everything from spies to diplomats to broadcasters to educators to identify, at the time, Soviet active measures, KGB campaigns designed to plant secrets in Cold War battlefields, plant false stories, basically trying to harm. The difference today is it's not the Soviet Union, and the battlefield is not some third world. It's Putin's government, and the battlefield is Facebook. The battlefield is Twitter. We don't have an equivalent of the Active Measures Working Group to help us kind of an interagency aspect. How do we bring together the U.S. around this? So there's a lot of different things that government can and should do. That's not to say that, again, just like in the parallel of cybersecurity, there's no role for the private sector. There's no role for us as individuals. If you want to speak to the personal side, I'll hit real quickly the private sector side. One of the other changes that's gone on in this space is essentially the power of these private companies, but not just companies writ large, but a handful of actors in them. We have entered a space that's different for those of us that study issues like war, where essentially a handful of people are now among the most powerful actors in all of war and politics today, and they never set out for that role. And they're really not all that interested in war and politics. Mark Zuckerberg set out to write really cool software designed to allow you to rate the hotness or not of your fellow schoolmates. That's the origin of what was originally called FaceMash. And now he is running not just one of the world's most profitable and powerful companies. He's making decisions on everything from should Russian disinformation warriors be allowed to use my platform, in what forms? Should I turn a blind eye to Myanmar generals engaging in genocide? Should I what are the rules and what kind of investment should my company make against recruitment by radical groups that range from ISIS to American neo-Nazis? And he alone has that kind of power to essentially tilt the battlefield one way or another, and tilting the battlefield can affect the outcome of everything from elections to the outcome of wars themselves. And so one of the things that we're watching is these companies, but even more so these individuals, come to grips with that power. And we liken them to essentially parents going through the stages of grief at what has happened to their babies. So if you know the stages of grief, initially they're in denial, and now they're kind of in the form of bargaining, of saying, okay, I'll do X, but you know what, I'm not going to do Y. And that's become a major political issue, not just in the United States, but pretty much any government, is this bargaining back and forth in terms of the companies, but also the individuals at the heads of them as they come to grips with this kind of power that they have.
And Adam, this was a giant question to leave us on. I'll say for us as individuals, very briefly, unfortunately, we have less power than government. We have significantly less power than these social media companies. But something that we can do is to begin to think of this engineered misinformation as a new kind of public health crisis. The way a fake, harmful story spreads through the information environment is a lot the same way that a virus or contagion does. It starts by being shared by and influencing someone who's a bit more credulous, a bit more vulnerable to this sort of stuff. But once it's been shared by one person, other people in their social network who know this individual are much more likely to believe it and share it in turn. This is broadly referred to as homophily, love of the same. It's a very human instinct. When someone in your social network tells you something, you're more liable to believe it and pass it on. Typically, this is a good thing. This is what helps us build societies in the first place. But at internet speed, and when a false story or headline can command the attention of hundreds of millions in a few hours, this can be devastating. So we need to, when we see, say, our friends or neighbors sharing information that's not quite true, it is up to us to step in and be the person to comment on Facebook, like, oh, you might want to check up on that, or to offer that contrasting point of view early on in the process. And it's also then the role of civil society to invest much more aggressively in information literacy programs, the same way that we invest today in public health programs in American schools. But I wanted to circle back real fast to government. Something I've been thinking about a lot over the last few days, just two data points to leave you with. In 2017, State Department was obligated about $100 million for public diplomacy initiatives. Virtually none of that money was allowed to be spent. The Global Engagement Center, the principal instrument for countering Russian influence abroad, had its hiring frozen, and as I understand it, did not have any Russian linguists on staff throughout 2017. The Trump administration did not have a cabinet-level meeting on the whole idea of information operations and influence until late 2018. And that cabinet-level meeting focused almost exclusively on infrastructural voting machine security and very little on this influence component. The reason there's this lack of focus is perhaps because emphasis on this draws into question the president's democratic mandate. But regardless of the reason for it, if there's not that focus from the top, we will never be prepared to deal with these issues.
And just one sentence from deep in the New York Times story, front page story about what happened in Alabama, is that evidently no laws were broken. It's all perfectly legal so far. Arnold.
Thank you. I'm back from 3 weeks in China after a 3-year absence. And we found that people were incredibly wedded to their iPhones, far greater than I've seen in the United States. And everybody agreed when we mentioned this that this was a two-way street, because the iPhone is an instrument of control as well as an instrument for getting information. And I'm just, it seemed to me that this could be the future, because the Chinese seem to be well ahead of this kind of technology. And I'm wondering if you had looked into that, and whether you had any comments on that particular situation?
There's a great kind of connection point in your question, in that the very first social network online, when you go back to literally the origin of the internet itself, was actually a social network that built around essentially geek scientists, basically people from kind of the equivalent of Big Bang Theory characters, talking and arguing back and forth about what was the best science fiction. And it's a very appropriate start for this space. And then, as you've hit on, what you have in China in terms of the both massive use, cutting across all your different forms of engagement in society. When you look at kind of the use of this smartphone for everything from, you have a system that essentially combines everything from social networks to online ordering, kind of all packed into one. Yeah, all packed into one. It's kind of the equivalent of it here, as if like Amazon, Facebook, Google, Yelp, all of them combined together. And it feels very sci-fi futuristic, and it is kind of what looms. But there's the other side of the science fiction of it, is that it's created the what is a potential and is becoming a reality of science fiction level of control that even a George Orwell wouldn't have been able to imagine. And that's the social credit system. If you're not familiar with it, it's essentially a combined kind of this, and again, the companies in China, they're state linked. So you have the ability to gather data on all the different activities in a person's life, and then it will be used to create a single numeric score of someone's perceived trustworthiness in the eye of both the companies and the government itself. So it's like a credit score, but it goes beyond it. So for example, if you buy diapers, your score goes up because you're a good parent. If you play video games for too long, your score goes down because you're screwing around. It's a network though, so it's not just your own activity, it's the activities of all the other people in your network. So for example, if your brother complains about the service at the the government-run hospital, well, he's a complainer. Your score goes down too, so then you go to your brother and say, hey, knock it off. The score matters because it translates into real-world rewards and potential punishments. And they might be micro-level rewards, free charging of your phone at a coffee shop, to you won't get access to flights, to you won't get access to beds on overnight trains if your score is too low, to your score is being moved into using for job evaluations. If your score is too low, you won't even be eligible to be interviewed for a certain job. To the score is being woven into internet dating. So if your score is too low in the eyes of the government, it will also be too low to be matched with someone who is attractive or not. And so this again feels very science fiction, but it points to what Emerson was talking about earlier, of how this sort of mass level of observation can be used to drive people towards kind of real world activities. And so it's a different kind of censorship, because it's not just about screening out discussion of certain things, which happens in China, but it's also about steering society as a whole towards certain types of behavior that the government wants.
And China is the predominant example of how a deeply digitally connected society can nonetheless remain authoritarian. You probably saw a lot of folks on WhatsApp, which is, on WeChat, which is referred to as a super app, which is basically a combination of Uber, Facebook, Twitter, Yelp, all these other services put together. And it's extraordinary. I have friends in China now, they love using the app. The downside, of course, is that all of that data is freely accessible to the government.
They're aware of that too.
Right. And that's just kind of the trade-off you take. And that's the basis then of the social credit system that Peter talked about. But a few other things to note on just the totality and sophistication of the Chinese system here. There are still some formal censors. There was a wonderful Times article last week that talked about how government censors today actually go through a course where they learn about Tiananmen Square so they can then censor it from mainstream conversation. But a lot of those folks aren't working for the government. They're working for private contractors, which are then hired by these companies in order to abide by the laws of the Chinese Communist Party. But added to this is an estimated 3 million folks who at least casually post online about how much they love the government. And the intent there is not so much to even censor or discredit or actively attack dissidents, but rather to make them seem a much smaller portion of that political conversation than they actually are. And the objective of all these things working in tandem is to just make political expression more trouble than it's worth. And it's always been the focus of the Chinese government not to eliminate this dissident expression entirely, but rather to ensure that there are enough breaks in place that it never achieves critical mass and viral momentum. What makes social media different from these previous social mobilizing technologies is that one person can make note of something and can very quickly start a movement. If you have breaks in place to stop that from happening, then you can enjoy all of the good things about the internet for economic growth while still maintaining totalitarian political control.
And you can see we like pinging off of each other. It also leads into two other things that I think are interesting. The first is the parallelism of that program of kind of creating a seeming online army, a voice of people, a popular opinion that maybe isn't popular, that's sort of created. That has parallels in American domestic politics with the practice of what's known as astroturfing. So astroturfing is kind of the evil twin of a grassroots movement. A grassroots movement is people who genuinely believe something and they push for it. Astroturfing is creating the perception that there is a grassroots movement there. And one of the kind of very first examples that we saw of this was actually back in the 2012 election, was the first sort of early examples of people buying mass numbers of fake followers and bots online. So, for example, Newt Gingrich is running a presidential campaign and is later reported to have bought over 1 million followers. So it looks like million online followers. So it looks like he has this kind of movement behind him, but 1 million of them are essentially fake. So there's policies that he's pushing for. One was it was a moon base by 2020. They seem like they have support and they don't. And that idea of a AstroTurf movement, you can see that again moving into everything from the 2016 election to we'll see it in the 2020 election. The foreign policy question relevant to what you saw in China is, will that model that they've achieved be exported or not? And so we've seen everywhere from Cuba to Vietnam, interest in governments in having what they call the Chinese model. And so there's a foreign policy question for the United States. Do we push back against the export of that Chinese internet model? And what are we offering in opposition, if so?
Well, that's an interesting question for public diplomacy, at the heart of, I think, what's going on now. Greta Morris.
Let's see if I can figure out how to. Hello. I don't think I'm doing this right, but anyway, maybe you can hear me if I.
We'll repeat it if you know.
Thank you very much, and thank you for very, very interesting comments. I just want to go back to earlier. You mentioned this person named Spencer, who really seemed to get it, but the State Department countering ISIL folks did not. And I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit more about what Spencer did that was so effective. And then if I could just follow up with a comment, and I'd be interested in your views. It almost seems like that the next presidential candidates should take the lesson that if you're not a master or mistress of this kind of social media use, you really have no chance of being elected president. That seems to be really the avenue to political success, as well as success in countering disinformation or whatever other things you want to counter in terms of international relations.
Great question. I think I'll start with the second aspect first. This is a change akin to whether it was the telegraph or television, a new communications platform that affected everything from the news business to who was nominated and who was elected. The telegraph, for example, Abraham Lincoln does not become president in a pre-telegraph era. The telegraph is what carries the story of his debates with Douglas and gives this, little known, actually, doesn't even win the election in Illinois, gives him notoriety to television. Of course, the stories of how it changes starting in the 1960s, and political candidates have to be telegenic, which is an idea that wouldn't have mattered beforehand. The same thing is played out with social media. And it's noteworthy in lots of different ways. One of the interviews that we did was with a top political strategist who went through all the different ways that Donald Trump should not have won in 2016. Not kind of morally should not, but he sort of ticked through all the advantages that his rivals had, both for the Republican nomination and then against Clinton. All the old measures of campaign cash to number of offices to newspaper endorsements. And he basically says, it didn't matter because the rules have changed. And those rules are now in place. And Trump joined social media, if I recall, at the age of 61. Every now politician who will run for whether it's president to mayor to student council will have joined beforehand. They'll bring a trail of stories behind them. They're going to have learned the lessons of what works, what doesn't. So it's here to stay. And I think you can, again, see the changes. A great one that we play with in the book is the back and forth of the story of George Allen and Beto O'Rourke. George Allen in 2000 was George Allen was a Republican senator from Virginia who many people thought had the inside track to the Republican nomination in 2008. This is something Emerson was talking about, the change of a world of observation. He does a campaign stop at a rural park in Virginia, says a remark that's essentially racist. In the past, it wouldn't have even been noticed because it happens in the middle of nowhere. But this new service called YouTube has just started. And that remark, the macaca moment, goes viral, and George Allen never wins another election because he's surprised by the idea that there's someone with a camera watching him. Move forward, Beto O'Rourke, his entire campaign was built, not his entire, but his celebrity, his campaign was built about a full embrace of social media. In fact, he's constantly taping himself and sharing it with the world. And it brings him notoriety beyond Texas, too. He's now one of the potential nominees for the Democrats. So again, you see kind of a change in both tactics, but also who it draws in. That is not just in the United States. That is happening everywhere. What's played out in Brazil is a good illustration of this. I'll hit you. You can hit the other question if you'd like.
Sure. So what we mean when we talk about the contrast between Spencer and the state.
The lesson that Spencer had and kind of
Well, Spencer was understood, pardon me.
I'll hit it. So
Sure.
Spencer understood in particular two different things. One was the power of narrative. And narrative is something that matters not just in kind of writing, but basically it hits kind of our very psyche. One of the very first studies in psychology, way back in the field of, back in the 1940s, they presented a film to test subjects that showed three shapes: a circle, a triangle, and a square. And the shapes are interacting. And the test subjects, all but one of them, came up with stories to explain what was happening. The circle was mad at the square. The triangle was sad. One of the things that the test subjects do also is that, and it's kind of illustrative, they put gender on top of it. A he, a she, in talking about the circle and square. Only one of the test subjects doesn't see narrative in what is just, again, shapes interacting. And it's basically the idea that we are all hardwired for story. And Spencer got that and used that in story in everything from how you explain it to others to the importance of characters and the like. And he used that to drive his own aim towards celebrity. Another thing that he got was kind of the back and forth of drawing attention and how that can be used for you, but also can be used against you. So to carry this over to the story of the counter ISIS. One, in no way, shape, or form did they get the power of story, of narrative. They just felt like if they pushed out a fact, that would win out. Another thing that they didn't get was attention, and how attention can be something that you use for yourself, but you can also, it can backfire upon you. There's this weird moment, probably the strangest moment in all of public diplomacy history, where the U.S. State Department argues back against a single ISIS member account and says, "You're not telling the truth. That image that you're presenting to the world is actually Hungarian pornography." Which first raises the question, why is the U.S. State Department arguing with someone about Hungarian pornography? And second, why are they granting to this single ISIS member the full attention of the United States government? It's like shining a spotlight, which is giving this single ISIS member exactly what they want. And so it's a sort of strange moment that to us kind of, again, illustrated that they didn't get it. They thought facts would matter over everything else. They also didn't understand that in this kind of game that they were essentially sort of, it was like shining a spotlight in a battle against a network.
And I'll add a few things there. To the credit of the State Department, Spencer Pratt isn't a massive government bureaucracy. Even after, I think we were talking about the Center for Countering Terrorist Communications, which initially contracted out folks to individually reply on Twitter to ISIS dissidents saying, actually, this isn't haram. It wasn't a great messaging approach, and it was thoroughly lambasted by the U.S. press. Then we shift in 2016 to the Global Engagement Center. Well, the Global Engagement Center is created as an interagency organization to draw money from the Defense Department because there's no money to be had in the State Department. It's then appoints Mike Lumpkin from Defense to lead it because he's familiar with these issues and can actually do those interagency equities. Well, when you're leading an interagency organization, almost invariably you're more at the bottom of the list of trying to get attention at National Security Council meetings or additional policy priorities. So he has to navigate that. He discovers his most effective investments are in local groups that don't bear the moniker of the U.S. government on them. That's great, but then how do you report those results to Congress, which is eager to hear about how you prevented new recruits from coming to ISIS? And also, how do you prove that counterfactual in the first place? Those are the issues that confronted the GEC, and unfortunately, we're still not that much closer to solving them. And I wanted to circle back to the president question, which I find fascinating. I think any competitive candidate in the future is going to have to be very conversant at social media and is going to have to use it themselves. They will not be able to delegate that duty to a staff or to a chain of authorities where it takes multiple people. I think in the case of the Hillary Clinton campaign, as many as 11 folks reviewing a tweet before it was approved. Trump, as Peter said, was super late to the social media game, but because he understood branding so intuitively, he knew, and we hit this lesson again and again in the book. This is one of the rules of where we talk about. He knew the best way you continue to command attention is, in polite terms, throw as much crap at the wall as possible every day and see what sticks. He didn't necessarily always have an intuitive grasp for what would go viral and what wouldn't. But if he was sowing 8 or 10 stories a day, he knew that the media and public attention would leap on at least a few of them. And we see in the emerging social media celebrities now, who are also the emerging generation of American politicians, the most successful ones are and will be those who every day are out there sowing multiple storylines, which the media are then free to follow.
And there's a lesson in this as well, where it's not just, you asked about the politician, but there's also how political campaigns are organized in their strategy. So Trump won the attention war, the media war on Twitter. He gets the equivalent, depending on the study, somewhere around the equivalent of $5 billion worth of advertisements and attention from what he's able to kind of drive with this Twitter strategy. But his campaign wins votes via Facebook, where it had a very good strategy that allowed it to, through its own means and through gains from others, achieve massive amounts of data that allowed it to both simultaneously push out huge numbers of messages, but simultaneously micro-target. So Brad Parscale, who was the campaign manager, talked about how he was able to target an ad towards 14 people in a town in a Florida panhandle in a way, using Facebook ads in a way that he wouldn't have been able to do with TV commercials and the like. And so again, you're going to see every future political campaign operating in that way. To hit what Emerson was saying, one of the flaws of the Hillary Clinton campaign was not just her Twitter account, where you have this kind of bureaucratic approach, but it's also they were aware of the internet. They, arguably lost in 2008 in part to Obama because of his use of the internet. So they knew about it, but like every other army, they're fighting the last war. So they're structured for kind of a 2008-2012 campaign. The internet's changed in 2016. Same thing moving forward. So you're going to see playing out in 2020, who gets it, not just who gets it in terms of the individual politicians broadcasting themselves and using these strategies, but are their campaigns organized to engage in like war or not?
And last thing I'll leave you with, this example just occurred to me, but perfect for the upcoming presidential election. In the last month, Beto O'Rourke, Elizabeth Warren, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have all done Instagram live streams from their kitchens. How often has that happened in previous political cycles? It hasn't. But we're absolutely going to see more of that in future, and that's a vivid illustration of how rapidly this battleground changes.
Your kitchen and Instagram is the equivalent of the New Hampshire diner and a TV camera, right? It's the way of showing that you're real.
Fascinating comparison of Abraham Lincoln and O'Rourke, both losing the election but winning the narrative. We have a question in the back. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hi, my name is Allison Bartel, and I work on Asia programs at Internews. So you talked a little bit about the rules for going viral, and I think it's a really interesting phenomenon that a lot of them are really based in strategies for propaganda that have worked for a really long time. But I'm wondering, a lot of those are also based on this algorithm that, for instance, Facebook has set up where it doesn't value truthfulness, it values the eyeballs, the ad money. So if this algorithm were to be changed to value truthfulness, I mean, the companies are coming under increasing scrutiny for instance, like you mentioned in Myanmar. would that then change the rules? Would that change how people communicate on these platforms? And I think it also brings up interesting questions about whether the ways that people communicate are responding to the platforms now, like how our psyche is changing. And then I had a separate question on whether you looked at communications in more private channels, so like private Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp groups.
So, second question first. Private channels to a lesser extent, simply because they're hard to track. Even for folks who are doing a lot of like on-the-ground research, the only way to get in these private channels is to actually, say in the case of the Brazilian elections, have been there and be part of a lot of the same WhatsApp groups that are sharing information. This is a huge challenge for people who want to study these issues, because oftentimes the only way we know what information is being shared is if you're contemporaneously part of those groups. And that also biases our book and most coverage to date more toward Western nations, because WhatsApp is not the predominant means of communication in the West. It is in Brazil and India. And yeah, that biases coverage. But I'm really glad you brought up the social media companies, because that's one of the biggest takeaways and what actually constituted a lot of our research for this project, is that all this battle for attention is not playing out in some neutral battlefield. It is playing out in an environment that's been engineered by basically a handful of Americans who've come up in Silicon Valley, who are generally white, male, upper middle class, and who now assert an outsized political influence over the whole world. To your question about if the algorithms were re-engineered to favor truthfulness, I think that would mark a dramatic and positive change, but that, of course, raises questions of how you possibly do that, except retroactively, through more and more investment in content moderation, which is the direction these companies are moving in. And then also the moral, political, and ethical questions of to what extent are we willing to have private American corporations arbitrating the nature of political truth versus a public organization or some sort of public trust or some other entity. We are going to move toward a point where I think governments around the world are going to demand a more active role in the content moderation policies and procedures of these companies, simply because so much political discourse takes place on these platforms now.
I would follow up with about your question about the ethics of defining truth. That I think there has been a lot of gray and a lot of discussion around the issue, but I think in the cases, for instance, in India, where misinformation shared on WhatsApp has led to like 62 lynch mobbings in 2018, there is truth and falsity, and there are certain cases where that can be defined.
Yes, but an example I'm thinking of, so there are clear-cut cases, but something that's really stuck with me, it was, I think, an Interpreter Times article, I think it came out like the 28th, there was a new leak of the massive Facebook content moderation guidelines handbook. And there was essentially guidance that typically discussion of the Taliban is like verboten. You don't, it's moderated or deleted if you express pro-Taliban sentiment. But an addendum had been added that discussion of the Taliban in the context of a new ceasefire proposal was permitted. Again, I agree with the general sentiment, but that is a deeply political decision that's being made not by the American government or the government of Afghanistan or anyone else that has a public constituency, but by an American corporation.
I think what we're seeing is a evolution of a couple of things, and it actually links back to your question relevant to political campaigns. The first is the change in how we view these companies themselves. So once they were the belles of the ball, they were the companies that were most admired and the like across the political spectrum. And now both the right and left wing see political value in beating up on these companies for better and for worse. Not just inside the United States, whether it's in Europe and the like, the companies have their reputation is shifted to the other. So they've become political issues, and I don't think that's going away. The discussion of whether and how to regulate these companies is a political campaign issue in upcoming elections in a way that it was not in the past. The other kind of evolution is what Emerson was getting at, is how these companies view themselves. So they, at one point of time, were saying, we don't want to be the, quote, arbiters of truth, to use the Zuckerberg statement. To go back to how I was saying, the kind of, denial to bargaining. In the most recent American fall election, Facebook, once from saying we don't want to be an arbiter of truth, says, okay, if you are spreading false information about the upcoming election, where to vote or the like, we can boot you off the network. Twitter's doing the same. So the company has gone from saying we're not an arbiter of truth to, on certain issues, we've decided we will be an arbiter of truth. Now, where this gets really sticky is on issues like, for instance, extremism. So in content moderation, ISIS, all the different companies were okay with kind of booting off ISIS members. And again, bargaining. They'll say to Congress, well, you're mad at us about Russian misinformation stuff, but let us talk to you about all the things we did against terrorist groups. Okay, but what about, for example, far-right extremism in America? Ooh, now it got kind of awkward. Should you be allowed to call for violence in those cases? What's the level? What groups, if you show, for example, a ISIS black flag on your Twitter account, that image, the AI, the algorithm has been set up to automatically boot you. But if you, for example, put 1488, which is kind of a lingo of white supremacist groups on it, well, we've not set up the algorithm to boot you. Again, so there's these political debates inside the companies as to what's allowed or not that they've become part of, and in turn we're going to see an external political debate to decide, do we continue to allow them to be the ones that decide, or will government make that decision for them? So far, essentially, Europe says government's going to decide for you. The United States, we've mostly deferred to the private companies themselves.
Joanne Malley.
When you began your discussion, you were talking about various groups that you observed, individuals, political groups, countries, that almost had a playbook of how you go about spreading disinformation or getting bots and putting that misinformation out there. Flipping to the other side, which has kind of been touched upon, how does this not turn into a continually escalating game of whack-a-mole when you're an individual, a company, or a country trying to stop what you know is wrong, when you're a candidate who can say, I wasn't even in office. That was 2 years before I was in office when that happened. And you can say that, but it just seems as though you put out one fire and 10 more spring up. So if it's that easy to go to war and weaponize social media, how does the social media user or consumer become more savvy or band together or somehow have an advocacy group that is acceptable to government and private industry to combat it?
So great question, and it circles back actually to an earlier question of what can we do? And the what can we do is going to play out on multiple different levels. So one, for example, is the level of government. There is this strange and sad irony that the United States is the nation that invented the internet, and we are now the example that other nations point to of don't let what happened to them happen to us. And literally defense officials in other nations, we're the bad example, we're the victim example. And it goes back to what Emerson was saying. That's particularly sad when we know that, and yet our government is still kind of in that mode of denial and not organizing around it. So then the good side of that is that there are a series of things that governments around the world, democratic governments, have done to better secure themselves and still retain respect for rights and privacy. So in particular is what's played out in the Baltics, which are the best at this in part because they were among the first to be targeted by Russia. One of the things that they have there is a government basically kind of almost akin to sharing information about bad weather, a hurricane's coming. Here's an incoming information assault from another nation. Here's something that's about to go viral that is a false story that's been planted. That not only aids government and media awareness. A different example of this in Norway, the media companies compete against each other. They're corporate rivals, but they share in fact-checking. So they have these kind of checks on false stories that not only allow people to see them incoming, but also makes it easier when you as an individual, when your relative shares it, you're able to say, hey, that's that false story. Here's the origin point of it. It's not organic. It was originally planted. Here's the Russian bot account that it came from. So there's a government level to that all the way down to your individual level. There's the company role in this. One of the things that the companies have to in particular deal with, to echo back to the parallel of what Emerson was saying of public health, is the role of what are known as super spreaders. In public health, when disease viruses spread, we're all not equal. There is almost always a small number of people that are the key vectors of the spread of disease. They're called super spreaders. It's the same thing in online misinformation, disinformation. One of the interesting things about this is that there is actually an alignment in some of the worst ills online. So when there was a big data study of who were the accounts that Russia was trying to magnify. So of all the people online, who did Russia retweet the most? Who did Russia want more people to read and hear? It was actually conspiracy theorists and extremists. So for example, one of the key figures behind Pizzagate, the online conspiracy theory, was actually, if I remember the data point correctly, was the third most retweeted account by Russian bots. So of everyone in the world, and it was actually by several orders of magnitude to the fifth, sixth, and the like, Russia said, this individual, he's who we want more people to read about. We want to magnify their voice. So that points to, hold it, if we figure out how to deal with these super spreaders, we're going to have a positive effect on making it harder for disinformation campaigns. We're going to make it harder for conspiracy theories to spread. That circles back to your question about the kind of the role of corporations. This history should follow people. If you deliberately spread disinformation, you have a freedom of speech right to do that. You do not have an inherent right to do that on a privately owned and operated network. If you violate their rules, you can be booted from them. We've seen that effect of deplatforming and what it's done to figures like Alex Jones, Milo, and the like. So understanding the business of the internet is going to be the other one of factors of it. And then you and I, to make the public health parallel, it's weirdly okay for someone in our network to share disinformation. It's not okay for them to cough in your face. We should treat them in the same exact way. Gently correct them the first time they do it, but hey, actually, if you're keeping doing it, you are you are spreading, you are endangering not just me, you're endangering society in the same way.
And yeah, how do we stop playing whack-a-mole? I think with rule of law, laws that have been essentially absent as it regards the internet. This goes a bit further than what's in the book, but I'm a very strong proponent of free speech on the internet. But I think what happened in Alabama was wrong. I think if you're operating a group that is advocating for one candidate or another, you should be candid about it. If you're using other media that are not the internet, you have to be candid about it. The U.S. federal government has never applied the same scrutiny to the internet in this political context that it has the previous broadcast mediums. I think it's time for that to change.
Can I interject?
Sure.
The rules on skywriting are effectively, that's what is used to regulate online ads relevant to this space. Originally, it was the thinking that it is ephemeral, it will disappear just like kind of smoke disappears in the sky. And of course, we know it's the exact opposite, that something placed online can go viral and kind of live there forever. So it's a particular example of the updating of the law that is needed.
Exactly, an updating or an application of law that unfortunately never happened. Two super small things. If you're running a group on behalf of a candidate, just disclose who you are. And if there's a bot operating on a network, it should label itself accordingly. That's it. These two small changes would have a tremendous positive impact on American political discourse. And I mean, there are arguments back and forth on the constitutionality of it, but why not invite those challenges and have that discussion? You talked about the public banding together. Well, there was a time when government is the collective expression of the public will, but our interest in doing anything about the growing political salience of the internet's been entirely absent. And we tend to think of government as something other than our own collective decision-making. That has to change. That is how we stop playing whack-a-mole with some of these political problems.
David Shapinski, you have the last question.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm wrestling with two questions. You're probably not going to be able to answer them both, but I'll try to make them quick. One is, you said that you were neutral on sort of, you're not necessarily against some of the tools and so on. I'm aware of groups that have used the social media, particularly, videotaping police officers doing certain things and using that to basically show that there's a problem. So there are groups out doing that. There are also groups that have helped places like Kenya and even the Middle East help people navigate around violence or to track the violence. There's always questions about truth. The other thing that I'm wrestling with is where this stands in the history of propaganda. I mean, we have had situations over and over again in this country, going back to the birth of a nation, extremely powerful propaganda. It wasn't called that at the time, of course. All of it is preying. This social media is ultimately preying, I think, on our own prejudices, our own divisions, and so I'm wondering how you look at those two questions, or whichever one you can get at before Adam shuts it down.
So there's a danger when you're writing about the effects of a new technology to say, oh, this changes everything, or this is radically different. But the internet really is, in contrast to previous communications mediums, because it's the first one where any individual can speak to anyone else, anywhere in the world, but also that same message can reach tens of millions of people. It's individual interaction and a broadcast medium together. But the crucial difference between the internet and these previous platforms is also speed. When you propagate a piece of content through the system, there's no time to fact check it. There are no gatekeepers. This is usually taken as a positive thing, but it actually is a lot more mixed in practice, because there's no informed observer to inject a bit of caution into the claim that's being spread. There's no one to offer a bit of fact-checking. And in fact, fact-checking that often attempts to accompany viral claims usually receives 1 or 2% of the audience share of the underlying wild propaganda rumor. This is the new environment we're dealing with. And we have to take steps to adjust accordingly.
So I would say the first on the issue of the neutrality, I don't know if we're neutral. We're essentially saying that this is a technology And these are a set of rules that can be used for both good and bad ends, like every other technology in the past, whether it was a stone. The very first stone that was picked up was either used to probably build something or bash someone in the head. The same thing if we're talking here about anything from the rule of mass observation and no more secrets. The examples range from huge loss of privacy to we have this great story of war crimes being unearthed that, previously you would have had a mass killing that would have been gotten away with, that now it's been documented, to crowdsourcing. The Ice Bucket Challenge. The Ice Bucket Challenge was used to raise awareness of a disease by leaning into the idea that we all want our own kind of celebrity. It's kind of, it hit on a certain human psychology. It was also used to raise attention and fundraise for extremist groups. So there's always this duality, and we need to, the forces of good need to understand these rules and lean into them if they want to win out. To the propaganda side, again, to echo what Emerson was saying, I think it's a great way to end on, is that you can see kind of a parallelism with things in the past, but also how it's been taken to a new level. And a great illustration of what played out would be Project Infection, which was a KGB active measure back during the Cold War to plant the false story that the United States was behind the creation of AIDS. It is almost a perfect parallel in its structure to what they did against the US 2016 election and are continuing to do today. And whether it was originally they plant the false story in a series of front accounts. Back then it was a Indian newspaper that had actually been funded by the KGB, to they use false personas to validate it. A group of two East Germans pose as French scientists who say, hey, this news story is actually real, to then they target it at the political extremes of both sides. Back then during the Cold War, it was communist newspapers and the far-right Lyndon LaRouche campaign. And it works for them, but it takes them basically about 4 years to carry out the operation, to have it seen by, hundreds of thousands. By comparison, one story can be planted and using the very same idea of false front accounts and like, but through the power of social media, it can be seen by tens of millions within a set of hours, because what it's particularly leaning into is the fact that we're the ones who share it because of what you were saying, our own biases, our own interest in kind of achieving our own kind of celebrity and the like. And so in many ways, we're doing the work for the adversary. And until we understand that we are both targets and combatants in this space, we'll continue to be used. And that's probably the underlying message of the book, is we have to understand these new rules of the game if we want to stop being taken advantage of, whether it's by a political campaign, a marketing campaign, a foreign government disinformation campaign, because actually they're sharing all the very same dynamics.
Well, thank you for sharing the insights from your research and from your work and from your book. Please join me in thanking our speakers. Our next session will be the second Monday in February, Monday, February 11th. Our guest will be Assistant Secretary of State Marie Royce. Until then, we adjourn.
Okay, thank you.
Prove that they got the summer was like What? Oh, what's that fun? Yeah. Wasn't she good? And Sid was fabulous. It just, did you see till the end? Okay, wasn't that great? Did you get some swag at the end? They gave, they wrote me at the bitter end. Andrea's assistant comes out with a barrel of beautiful pen.
She was one of the first people I applied for a job.
But she came back after writing
I've done that on every single one of my books. Every single So even after
hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Nice to see you. Jacket like you. Macy's, right? No? Macy's, yeah! Good! They do good stuff. They do. So I just want to say, I've heard it's